It wasn't the storm that changed everything. It was a small piece of straw. One afternoon, a gust of wind sent it rolling across the dirt like a ball. The dog chased it, playful at first, until it disappeared into a narrow crack in the rock. But something was off. The straw didn't keep moving. It slowed, drifted sideways, then stopped. When the man followed, he felt it instantly. The wind was gone. Just gone. Why did it stop there? What he discovered next wouldn't just save his life. It would quietly change how an entire town survived winter. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The wind moved low across the western slope, dragging dust and brittle grass over hardened ground beneath a pale September sky, carrying a quiet chill that hinted at what was coming. The granite outcrop stood unmoved behind it all, casting a long, steady shadow over the empty land. Grant Calloway stood at the edge of the property longer than the seller expected him to. His weight settled evenly, but his posture carrying a quiet heaviness that didn't belong to his frame. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair fading into gray at the temples, and a thin, uneven beard that looked less like a choice and more like something he had stopped correcting. His face was angular, defined by hard lines and restraint. And his eyes never stayed still for long, moving across the land as if measuring it for things no one else could see. Years in the service had taught Igor to read terrain the way other men read signs, and that habit had outlived everything else. Not much to look at, the seller said, shifting beside an old pickup that had long since given up pretending to be new. Walter Briggs was in his late 60s, his skin weathered and darkened by decades under sun and wind, his voice slow and steady, in the way of a man who had learned that most things didn't need to be rushed. Wind hits this place hard, comes down from the northwest, and doesn't let up once winter settles in. Grant didn't respond right away because he wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking at the rock. The granite outcrop rose behind the land, not towering, but solid in a way that made everything around it feel temporary, its surface fractured and uneven from years of pressure and weather. Along one side, almost invisible unless you stepped closer, a narrow vertical crevice split the stone, thin enough to ignore but deep enough to matter if you paid attention. At first, Grant almost dismissed it, just another crack in a place that had already proven itself unforgiving, the kind of detail that didn't change outcomes. But he didn't turn away. Rook moved first, crossing the open ground with quiet certainty, his paws crunching softly over dry dirt and scattered frost. The German Shepherd was 5 years old, large but lean, built for endurance rather than display, with a black saddle coat and warm tan markings that caught the light in subtle ways. A faint scar ran along his left flank, barely visible beneath the fur, the kind that spoke of past moments rather than present weakness. He carried himself with a calm awareness, not restless, not unsure, just attentive in a way that felt grounded. He didn't bark or circle or react the way most dogs might in a new place. He simply moved forward. Grant watched him without calling him back, his hands resting in the pockets of a worn canvas jacket that had outlasted better things. "That yours?" Walter asked, glancing toward the dog. Grant nodded once. "Yeah." Walter studied the animal for a moment, then gave a small, knowing look. "Looks like he knows what he's doing." Grant's gaze didn't leave the dog. He knows when to stop. That was more than most men. Rook reached the base of the rock and slowed, his movement easing into stillness as he faced the narrow crevice, ears forward, body steady. He didn't understand what drew him there, but something held his attention long enough to make him stay. Grant followed, slower this time, not out of caution, but out of habit, the kind built from years of learning that rushing towards something often meant missing what mattered. The ground beneath his boots told a quieter story as he moved. Faint patterns in the dirt suggested where something had once been planted, and broken wooden stakes lay half-buried nearby, their edges worn smooth by time. Near the rock, the remains of a collapsed trellis leaned into the earth, its shape hinting at vines that had once climbed toward light before the land stopped giving anything back. Someone had tried to make this place work, not for a season, but for long enough to leave marks that time hadn't fully erased. Grant crouched briefly and brushed his fingers across the soil, feeling the resistance in it. the dryness, the quiet refusal to yield. Whatever had grown here had done so against the land, not with it, and he understood that kind of effort more than he cared to admit. He stood again and stepped closer to the rock, where the crevice revealed itself more clearly up close. It wasn't wide, just enough for a man to turn sideways and pass through, but it ran deeper than it first appeared, the light fading quickly inside as if the stone had decided where the world ended. The wind moved around them, but not through. Grant noticed that before he realized he was noticing anything at all, the pressure of the air shifting in a way that didn't announce itself but made itself known anyway. Out in the open, the wind pressed constantly, tugging at his jacket and slipping cold fingers down the back of his collar, insisting on being felt. Here, near the stone, that insistence weakened, not disappearing entirely, but softening just enough to matter. "You find something?" he said quietly. Rook didn't look back. The dog took one small step forward, then stopped again, as if testing something invisible, something that didn't belong to sight but still held presence. Grant followed, but he didn't step fully into the crevice, just close enough to feel the difference settle against him. It was subtle, not the absence of wind, but the absence of pressure, and the distinction mattered more than it should have. Behind him, Walter let out a slow breath. "There's nothing in there," he said, "just a crack. Been like that longer than I've been around." Grant gave a faint nod but didn't turn, because maybe it was nothing, and most things were, but he had learned long ago that what looked insignificant from a distance sometimes carried weight up close. The memory came without warning, as it often did when something quiet made space for it. A different place, a different kind of wind, one that carried heat and dust instead of cold, moving through structures that didn't hold, through walls that failed in ways no one expected until they did. He had seen men build strong things in the wrong places, and had watched those things fail anyway. Grant exhaled slowly, his breath faint in the cooling air, and reminded himself that he wasn't here because this land was good. He was here because it was what he could afford. After the service, there hadn't been anything waiting for him. No home, no one holding a place open, just a small amount of money, a truck that barely held together, a handful of tools, and a dog that had never once chosen to leave. He had tried other places before this, closer to town, with better soil and easier ground, but they hadn't worked, or maybe he hadn't, and after a while, the difference stopped mattering. He had stopped believing that better places led to better outcomes. He had seen too many men stand on solid ground and still lose everything, and eventually, you stop chasing better and start looking for something that doesn't break you right away. Grant looked out across the valley, where a few distant buildings stood scattered against the open land, small and exposed, and from one of them, a thin line of smoke rose into the air before bending sharply under the force of the wind. That would be constant soon. By November, the temperature would drop and stay there, and the wind would settle into something relentless, something that didn't need strength to wear things down, only time. Wood would creak, doors would freeze, and heat would disappear faster than it could be made. Grant had seen what that did. He had felt it in places far worse than this. Rook shifted slightly, stepping closer to the crevice again, nose lifting as he tested the air, still focused, still certain in a way that didn't demand explanation. Grant watched him for a long moment, aware of the difference between reacting and understanding, and knowing that he didn't understand this yet, but also knowing that he wasn't walking away from it either. He stepped forward just enough to stand at the edge of the crevice again, feeling that quiet change settle around him. Not safety, not certainty, but something steady, something that held. He looked down at Rook, then back into the narrow shadow cutting into the granite. "It's nothing," he said quietly. But he didn't leave. It wasn't enough to believe in. It wasn't enough to understand, but it was enough to make him stay. And for Grant Calloway, that was already more than most places had ever given him. By the last week of October, the valley had begun to change in ways that had nothing to do with snow. The light went thin earlier each afternoon. The ground no longer gave back the warmth it took during the day. Even the silence had altered. It was no longer the broad, open quiet of autumn, but the waiting quiet of something tightening, as if the land itself were bracing for a weight still beyond the horizon. From the ridge above the property, the wind came lower now, more deliberate. It no longer crossed the western slope like passing weather. It lingered. Grant Calloway answered that change the only way he knew how. He built. The cabin rose slowly from the earth in straight lines and plain decisions, shaped by muscle memory and the kind of practical thinking that leaves no room for beauty. Grant cut every beam himself, hauled every length of timber, checked every corner until it sat square. It was not the kind of place a man dreamed about. It was the kind of place a man convinced himself would be enough. One room, a low roof, a narrow door turned slightly south, a stove at the center, walls thick enough to look dependable. He had seen structures with less survive, worse. That was what he told himself. Rook stayed near him through every hour of it. The German Shepherd never got underfoot, never barked at nothing, never chased shadows the way younger dogs did. He watched. Sometimes he sat at the edge of the work area with his ears lifted, his amber eyes fixed not on Grant's hands, but on the moving air around them, as if listening to something too thin for human hearing. Other times, he paced the perimeter of the property with quiet purpose, then returned to the half-built cabin and lay beside the stack of cut timber, as though guarding a thing that did not yet know whether it could protect them back. Grant worked until his hands split at the knuckles and the skin at the base of his thumbs turned raw from the handle of the adze. He did not complain. He had long ago learned that pain was more obedient when ignored. By the third week, the cabin stood complete enough to be called a shelter. From a distance, it looked right. That was the most dangerous thing about it. It looked like every other small cabin a man in that country might trust with his life. Daniel Hargrove saw it that way the first time he rode past. Then, less so the second. Daniel was the kind of man weather leaves behind instead of defeating. He was broad in the chest, heavy through the middle, with a thick graying beard that grew outward more than down, and a face creased deep around the mouth from years of biting back words. He lived farther north along the slope in a place half hidden by junipers, and there was something in the way he sat a horse, loose but never careless, that suggested he had outlasted more than he liked to speak of. When he reined in near Grant's fence line, he did not offer greeting first. He simply looked at the cabin, then at the open ground around it, then toward the ridge where the northwestern wind would break and drop. "You're building it like the others," he said. Grant, standing on the short ladder by the doorway, drove one last nail flush and climbed down. "It'll hold." Daniel's eyes stayed on the roofline. "Maybe." Then he shifted his jaw, as if testing whether to say more. "That's not what breaks first." He left after that, and Grant pretended the words stayed behind with the hoof prints. But that evening, while stacking the last of the split wood near the wall, he found himself looking not at the cabin's shape, but at the wide-open stretch between it and the rock. The first hard night arrived without ceremony. The fire in the stove caught well and held steady. The room warmed quickly near the center, and for a little while Grant allowed himself to believe he had judged the season correctly. He ate a bowl of beans and salt pork from a tin plate, listening to the metal settle in the stove as heat built inside it. Rook slept near the door, his body curled, but not deeply at rest. Outside, the wind passed in long, low strokes across the walls. Near midnight, Grant woke, not to a loud sound, but to the wrongness of the air. The fire had not died. The stove still carried a red glow behind its grate, yet the warmth around the bed had thinned, and the floor beyond the blanket felt like stone pulled from a creek in winter. He sat up and listened. The door trembled in its frame in a faint, repeating shiver, a small, dry movement that was almost too precise to hear. Then he felt it. The cold was not everywhere. It was coming from somewhere. He swung his feet down and crossed the room. Rook was already awake, already pressed low against the bottom edge of the door where the wood met the frame. The dog's shoulders were angled into the seam, and the fur along his neck stirred with each narrow thread of air that slipped through. He did not move when Grant knelt beside him. He only glanced once, as if to say the problem had been here waiting for him to notice. Grant put his hand along the base of the frame and held it there. The cold entered not like a gust, but like a blade, thin, precise, constant. It moved along the floorboards and spread outward under the table, under the cot, into every place where warmth had no weight to resist it. That made it worse than a storm. A storm announced itself. This simply took. The next morning, he set to work sealing the cabin more tightly. He packed cloth into the lower seam of the door and drove narrow strips of wood along the inner frame. He checked every joint in the walls, every place where one log met another, filling whatever gaps he could find with resin, bark, and patience. The labor felt good because labor always did. It gave the hands somewhere to put what the mind did not want to hold. That evening the room stayed warmer. Not warm exactly, but improved. Enough for a man to mistake progress for victory. By midnight, the heat had thinned again. This time it was not only the door. The walls themselves seemed to give back the warmth too easily, as if the cold outside had more patience than the fire inside. Grant stood motionless in the middle of the room, turning his head slowly, not chasing a draft now, but listening to the structure answer the weather. The cabin had been built correctly. That was what unsettled him most. Nothing in it was careless. Nothing in it was wrong by ordinary standards. Yet the warmth would not stay. 2 days later, the wind strengthened. It did not come screaming over the ridge, not at first. It leaned. It pushed. It settled against the cabin in long, weighty intervals that made the walls carry strain in their own voices. The logs gave small sounds under pressure, not cracking, not failing, but working harder than a house should have to work, before winter had even properly begun. Grant rode into Cedar Hollow the next morning for lamp oil, nails, and a sack of flour. On the North Road, before the town came into view, he passed the remains of a farmstead that had taken damage the previous winter. The fence rails on the western side were still broken inward. Part of the barn roof had peeled back and never been repaired. The empty cattle enclosure behind it looked less abandoned than defeated. He had heard about that place before he bought his land. A late-season cold front, 3 days of hard wind, half the herd lost before the owner could move them. At the time, it had sounded like one more valley story meant to test whether a newcomer knew how to look worried. Standing there now, with the wind pushing at his coat and the broken barn, showing him what persistence could do, it no longer felt like a story. Outside the general store, Sarah Whitlock was stacking crates of canned peaches and flour sacks against the wall before the weather turned worse. She was a tall woman, lean through the shoulders and hips, with dark brown hair pinned back in a way that had already begun to loosen in the wind. Her skin held the pale, weather-marked tone of someone who spent as much time outdoors as in, and her eyes had that rare stillness found in people who have learned that panic wastes effort. "You're the one on the Carter place," she said, without introducing herself first. Grant set the sack of flour in the truck bed. "That's right." Sarah balanced one crate on her thigh before lowering it into place. "They didn't lose it all at once," she said. "That's what people remember wrong." She straightened and brushed dust from her hands. First winter took the animals. Second winter took their nerve. By the time the house gave in, they had already left it in their minds. Grant looked at her. She met his eyes without softness and without cruelty. "Win doesn't have to win in one night," she said. "It just has to keep taking." That sentence stayed with him longer than Daniel's had. The first true freeze came 2 nights later. Grant woke before dawn with the feeling that the room had grown larger around him, the kind of false spaciousness cold creates when heat withdraws from corners and leaves only the center alive. The stove still held embers. He had banked the fire carefully. It should have lasted. And yet the cabin had changed again. Rook had moved back to the door, not curled this time, braced. His body was set along the path of the cold, as though instinct had taught him the shape of an enemy. He was trembling, not violently, but enough for Grant to see it. That was the moment the truth stopped being theoretical. This was not a problem of craftsmanship. It was not a weak joint or a careless seam or a door that needed one more strip of wood. The cabin was doing exactly what cabins like this had always done in open ground under a hard wind, losing slowly until slow became fatal. Grant stood in the half-light and looked around the room he had built with his own hands. The bed, the stove, the table, the stacked wood, all of it honest, all of it insufficient. Then his eyes went past the window to the dark line of stone beyond. He remembered the edge of the crevice, the way the pressure in the air had changed there, not vanished, changed. Behind him, the stove let out a small metallic tick as it cooled. Grant took his coat from the peg by the door. Rook rose at once. The cabin remained standing as they stepped outside, square and proper against the paling sky. It simply no longer looked like the place that would carry them through the winter. At the beginning of November 1997, the warning came over the local radio with the kind of calmness that made it impossible to ignore. A strong cold front was expected to move across the western slope within 12 days. Temperatures would drop sharply. Winds from the northwest would strengthen and remain dangerous long enough to make exposure a serious risk. The voice delivering the forecast did not try to frighten anyone. It didn't have to. Men who lived in that country understood that weather became most dangerous when it was described without drama. Grant Calloway listened from inside the cabin, standing beside the table he had built with his own hands. The stove was cold. Morning light entered in a pale slant through the window, touching the bed, the pegs on the wall, the stacked wood in the corner. The room looked orderly, honest, almost respectable. That made it harder to bear. There are few things more discouraging than a shelter that still looks dependable after you have already understood it will fail. He shut off the radio and stood in the silence for a moment, hearing only the faint rattle of the loose latch near the door. 12 days. That was not enough time to make mistakes, and not enough time to pretend he still had choices he no longer possessed. He spent the first half of the morning moving around the cabin as if another round of inspection might reveal a weakness small enough to fix. He checked the seams he had already packed, pressed against the lower boards, tested the joints where the logs met. He circled the structure twice, then a third time more slowly, not because he expected a different answer, but because men in bad situations often go through the motions of hope long after hope has become impractical. Rook followed some of that work, but not all of it. The dog's attention moved differently now. He was less interested in the cabin itself than in the air around it. He paused often, nose lifted, then turned and crossed the yard in loose arcs, ears angled toward the ridge as if tracking a distant sound too thin for Grant to hear. At 5 years old, he had grown into the steadiness of a working dog, but there were still rare moments when some playful instinct surfaced through all that discipline. Grant had always liked those moments more than he admitted. They were proof that the world had not taken everything from him. By noon, the wind had begun arriving in uneven bursts instead of long, steady pressure. It came in fits, then fell away, then returned from nearly the same direction with a slightly different weight. Grant was near the west wall, prying loose a warped strip of wood he had decided to replace, when something tan and ragged rolled through the corner of his sight. It was a round bundle of dry straw and brittle grass, probably torn loose from an old stack somewhere up the slope, driven low across the ground by a sudden gust. It tumbled fast over the hard dirt, caught briefly on a stone, spun, then kept going. Rook saw it at the same moment. For 1 second, the dog forgot every burden that had made him seem older than his years. He sprang after it with an eagerness that looked almost young, paws striking the ground in quick, precise bursts, body stretched cleanly forward. There was no caution in him then, only pursuit. Grant straightened and called his name, but the sound landed too late. Rook wasn't disobeying. He was simply answering instinct before thought could catch him. The straw bundle rolled straight toward the granite outcrop behind the cabin. Grant expected it to vanish directly into the narrow crevice. Instead, something stranger happened. As it neared the split in the rock, it drifted right, as though the force driving it had been nudged sideways. Its speed bled off in uneven increments. It did not shoot deeper into the crack. It slid, curved, and then almost settled in a shaded section just inside. Rook disappeared after it. Grant was already running. He crossed the yard in long strides, boots knocking loose grit and dry weeds aside. The crevice looked narrower as he reached it than he remembered, but concern erased hesitation. He turned his shoulders and entered without thinking much beyond the dog's name. "Rook!" His voice went in and came back changed, not a true echo, something duller, closer, as if the rock had swallowed the space sound usually traveled through. He took another step and felt the difference immediately. The wind did not follow him inside, not fully. It was still there at the mouth of the crevice, still visible in the moving grass and dust beyond the opening, but the force of it did not hold together where he stood. Pressure that had ruled the open yard all morning seemed to break apart against the stone. The noise beyond remained, but stripped of command. What reached him inside the crack was not silence exactly. It was something stranger, air that no longer behaved like an enemy. Rook stood several feet ahead, half turned, the straw bundle resting near one paw. The dog's posture held none of the alarm Grant had expected. He looked alert, yes, but settled too, as though he had entered a place that changed the rules of the world without needing to explain itself. Grant slowed and let his breathing catch up. From outside, the crevice had looked like little more than a fracture. From within, it revealed shape. The entrance was narrow, but after a few feet the space widened slightly, enough to hold a man standing at an angle. The wall on the right bent inward in a way that would have been easy to miss from open ground. The left rose straighter and darker, veined with old mineral stains. Dust, leaves, and a few brittle stems had collected in the deeper section, but not in the pattern they would have if wind ran straight through. Things had settled here, not been dragged onward. Grant crouched and looked toward the straw again. It had not blown deeper into the crevice. It had not spun back out. It had drifted, slowed, and come to rest in that offset pocket, as though the air itself had lost its direction before arriving there. He placed one hand flat against the stone, cold, solid, unimpressed by everything outside it. There are moments when understanding arrives like triumph. This was not one of them. What came to Grant felt closer to embarrassment, not because he had failed to see it, but because he had been thinking in only one direction. He had spent weeks asking how to build a stronger wall. The rock was quietly offering a better question. What if survival here depended less on resisting the wind than on stepping out of its reach? He looked back toward the opening. Outside, the gusts still crossed the yard in visible strokes, tugging at the dry grass, lifting dust, pressing the cabin from the same direction that had tormented every hour of his days. But inside the crevice, something in the shape of the stone interrupted that force. It didn't make the wind disappear. It made the wind lose coherence. That difference might be the whole answer. Rook nosed the straw bundle once, then lifted his eyes toward Grant with an expression so matter-of-fact it nearly made him laugh. The sound came out before he could stop it, brief, dry, and strangely unfamiliar in his own throat. He had not made a sound like that in a long time. Relief had little to do with it. It was the shock of watching a problem stop being larger than the world around it. A voice from outside interrupted the moment. "You lose something in there?" Grant turned toward the opening. A young man stood just beyond the entrance, framed by gray daylight and moving grass. He was maybe 25, narrow through the shoulders, with sandy hair flattened beneath a worn wool cap and skin reddened by wind. A coil of rope hung over one shoulder. His face was thin, earnest, and not yet trained into the guarded look older men in the valley wore by default. Grant recognized him after a second. Eli Mercer. He worked wherever work appeared, hauling feed, mending fences, loading grain, helping men who did not want to ask for help twice. People said he had come west after burying his father back in Kansas and simply never found a better place to stop. He carried himself like a man still learning how to belong somewhere. "Just the dog," Grant said. Eli took one step closer and peered into the crevice. "Didn't know it opened up in there." "Neither did I." Eli looked from Grant to Rook to the offset wall where the straw had stopped. Then he glanced out at the yard again, where the wind still moved hard across the open ground. "Feels different," Grant nodded once. "It does." That was enough. Eli left after a moment, not because the conversation was over, but because some things are diminished by too much language. Grant appreciated that about him more than he would have said aloud. He remained inside the crevice after the young man was gone, palm resting again against the stone. He was no engineer. He could not have diagrammed what the rock was doing to the air, but he had spent enough years staying alive in places where small misunderstandings had fatal consequences to recognize the shape of truth when it finally showed itself. This was not a hiding place. It was an answer. By the time he stepped back into the open yard, the cabin looked smaller than it had that morning, not weaker, just temporary. Rook trotted out ahead of him, whatever game had started with the straw already forgotten. Grant turned once more toward the dark line of the crevice, studying the narrow entrance that revealed so little from outside. Then he walked back to the cabin, took hold of the first board, and began pulling it free. He did not yet know the exact form the new structure would take. He only knew that the weather report had given him 12 days, and the wind, through a dog chasing a piece of straw like it mattered more than anything else in the world, had given him the rest. By the time the next morning arrived, one wall of the old cabin had already begun to come apart. Grant Calloway had not torn into it with anger. There was nothing violent in the work, nothing reckless. He removed the boards one by one, stacking the salvageable pieces in careful rows beside the granite outcrop, as if order alone might keep the coming weather from gaining ground. The cabin stood open on one side now, its inner shape exposed to the cold air. And yet the sight did not unsettle him as much as it should have. What unsettled him was how little regret he felt. A man ought to feel something when dismantling the first shelter he had raised with his own hands. Grant felt only the weight of time. He stopped before going too far. Tearing down the old cabin was one thing. Trusting the crevice enough to build inside it was another. He had seen too many men commit to bad ideas because fear of delay felt heavier than fear of being wrong. So instead of rushing headlong into the stone, he gave the next several days to watching. He went to the crevice in the weak blue light before sunrise, when frost still silvered the ground and the world had not yet warmed enough to stir its own currents. He returned at noon, when the sun reached the granite face and threw a shallow brightness along the entrance without touching the deeper pocket inside. He came again late in the day, when the wind descended from the ridges with more discipline and less mercy. Each visit taught him something small, and what mattered was that the small things never contradicted one another. He had no measuring instruments, no paper with calculations, no training that would have allowed him to name what he was seeing in the language educated men might have used. What he had instead were the instincts of someone who had survived places where misunderstanding the shape of danger did not result in embarrassment, but burial. Rook became part of the study without ever being asked. The German shepherd moved in and out of the crevice with the ease of an animal that trusted what its body knew before its mind named it. At the mouth of the crack, the fur at his neck lifted, and his ears flicked constantly in the moving air. A few steps farther in, that agitation faded. Deep enough inside, he would lie down with his front paws crossed, not sleepy, not careless, but settled in a way he never allowed himself to be in the open yard. Grant tested this more than once, tossing a stick or a knot of dry grass toward the entrance, watching where it drifted, where it turned, and where it lost urgency. The answer was always the same. The crevice did not run straight back as he had first assumed. Its mouth opened toward the northwestern wind, but not cleanly. It faced it at a slight angle, enough to invite the force in without allowing it a direct line through. Then, deeper inside, the right-hand wall bent inward and the channel shifted subtly to the side. That small deviation did more than a thick wall could have done. The gusts that entered did not continue intact. They struck, spread, scattered, and spent themselves before reaching the deeper section. What remained inside was not calm born of sheltering depth alone, but calm produced by disruption. That was what mattered. The stone did not overpower the wind. It confused it. Grant stood one afternoon with his palm against the right wall, tracing the bend with his eyes as the open yard beyond the mouth flickered with moving grass and dust. Outside, the force remained visible, hard, organized, relentless. Inside, it arrived broken. He had spent months thinking in terms of strength, thicker boards, tighter joins, heavier doors. The rock offered a different arithmetic. Survival here might have less to do with what a wall could endure than with whether the danger ever reached the wall intact in the first place. That thought should have excited him. Instead, it embarrassed him a little. He had been trying to outbuild a thing the land itself had already solved. On the 5th day after the radio warning, he rode into Cedar Hollow for iron brackets, spikes, lamp oil, and whatever fasteners he could afford. He also went because a man alone too long can start mistaking obsession for clarity. He wanted, though he would not have admitted it aloud, to place his idea against another mind and see whether it remained standing. Darren Holt's yard was the worst possible place for that, and therefore the right one. The lumberyard sat beside Darren's workshop, a long, weathered structure with a broad overhang and timber stacked in tight, disciplined ranks. Everything about the place suggested habit, order, and an old distrust of improvisation. Darren himself carried the same qualities. He was in his late 50s, tall in the narrow, stringy way men sometimes become after decades of hard labor. His face had almost no softness left in it. The cheeks were hollowed, the jaw long and angular, the beard cropped close and gray enough to blend into the weathered skin beneath it. His left hand was missing part of one finger, a loss people in town still mentioned when they wanted to explain his temper. He had taken it off in a saw accident during a blizzard repair years earlier, trying to finish a job before the roof gave way. After that, people said, he trusted precision more than hope and became less patient with anyone who confused originality for wisdom. He looked up as Grant stepped down from the wagon. "You're back sooner than a man should be if his cabin is already standing." Grant handed over the short list. Darren read it once and frowned. Brackets, spikes, more hardware. He lifted his eyes. "What did you build wrong?" Grant could have lied, but the man before him had spent too many years around bad repairs and proud men not to hear the strain in it. "I'm not fixing the cabin." Darren set the paper down on the counter. "Then what are you doing?" Grant glanced toward the line of granite visible beyond the far sheds. "Building somewhere else." Darren followed the look, then gave a short laugh that carried no amusement. "That split in the rock?" Grant nodded. For a moment, Darren said nothing. He stepped around the counter, close enough now that Grant could see how pale and sharp the older man's eyes were. They were the eyes of someone who measured everything against failure first. "That isn't shelter," Darren said. "That's a damage line." "It changes the wind." Now Darren laughed properly, though the sound was still thin and humorless. A couple of men near the wagon shed glanced over and then busied themselves with not listening. "You've been in bad places too long," Darren said. "That kind of life teaches a man to see patterns where there's only ruin. A crack in a stone isn't a design. It's what's left after pressure wins." The words stung because they were near enough to the truth to be dangerous. If Grant had heard them a year earlier, he would have answered from pride alone. There had been a time when any contempt, deserved or not, demanded to be met with equal force. But standing there now, with the shape of the crevice already fixed in his mind, he felt something stronger than defiance. He felt alignment. For the first time in months, he was not moving because fear was behind him. He was moving because the logic in front of him held. He did not need Darren to approve it. He did not even need Darren to understand it. So, he simply said, "Then I'll find out." Darren watched him for a long moment, as though waiting for the performance of wounded pride to begin. When it didn't, he turned back toward the list. "You'll pay now," he muttered. "I don't give credit against rock." Grant paid in cash. Outside, he loaded the wagon in silence. Rook, who had been waiting near the hitch rail, came to stand beside him, watching the transfer of hardware and timber with that same grave attention he gave everything once it mattered. The dog's ears twitched once toward the workshop, where Darren's laugh still seemed to hang in the sawdust-heavy air. The ride home gave Grant enough time to see the plan in sequence rather than fragments. He would not reinforce the old cabin again. He would strip it for what it was still worth. The door, the stove, usable boards, brackets, nails, shelving, every sound piece of labor that did not deserve to be wasted. Then he would build inside the crevice, not at the very back where darkness would own the place, but deep enough that the broken force of the wind never regained itself. It would not be wide. It did not need to be wide. One exposed front wall, one door, one roof line fitted tightly enough to let the stone do the rest. When he returned, the light was already thinning. He did not step into the old cabin first. He walked straight to the crevice and stood at its mouth while the evening wind crossed the yard behind him. It reached the entrance with all the confidence it had shown across the open ground. It reached his chest with none of it. That night, he lit the stove in the old cabin one last time, not because he trusted the structure, but because he owed it the courtesy due any honest failure. He sat on the bed with his elbows on his knees, watching the glow pulse behind the iron grate while Rook lay at his boots. The cabin had done what it could. That was more than could be said of many things in life, but it belonged to an answer he no longer believed in. By first light, he had started taking the wall apart. The work no longer had a beginning or an end. It simply resumed each morning where exhaustion had dropped it the night before. Grant Calloway rose in darkness, fed the stove just enough to wake feeling into his hands, and stepped outside before the eastern sky had committed itself to light. The old cabin stood in pieces now, stacks of boards, salvaged beams, shelves, the narrow door, iron fittings, coils of nails pulled one by one from wood that had once pretended to be a home. He had stopped thinking of it as demolition. It was extraction. He was pulling usefulness out of failure before winter could claim both. The new structure, if it could yet be called that, advanced more slowly than any building he had ever raised. Inside the crevice, the rules were different. A normal cabin allowed a man to correct his lies later. He could force two imperfect boards together, fill the seam, hide the weakness under another layer, and trust distance to forgive what accuracy had not. The stone forgave nothing. Every piece of timber had to meet the granite honestly, or the wind would discover the lie before the day ended. That was what made the labor so punishing. Grant was no longer merely building walls. He was translating the shape of the rock into wood. He took one salvaged beam after another, carried it to the entrance of the crevice, pressed it against the stone, marked the shape where it failed to fit, then hauled it back out to shave it down with the adze. Sometimes he needed 3 passes, sometimes 8. More than once he carried the same beam in and out until his shoulders trembled with the strain, and the inside seam was still wrong by less than the width of his smallest finger. In the old cabin, such a flaw would have passed unnoticed. Here, it would become a path. By the 3rd day, the backs of Grant's hands had split open in fine red cracks where the cold and dry air kept finding skin beneath the cloth wraps. His grip left dark stains on pale wood. He noticed them only when he stopped long enough to lift another piece and found dried blood in the grain. The weather had sharpened faster than the forecast had promised. Water filmed with ice before sunrise. Tools bit like cold metal always does, suddenly, personally, when touched with bare skin. Still, he kept working. Rook stayed close enough that Grant no longer had to look for him. The German Shepherd had mapped the threshold between safety and exposure better than any man could have. At the mouth of the crevice, where air still entered in broken swirls, the dog held himself differently. Neck higher, ears active, paws set wider apart. Deeper in, where the wind lost its force, his posture changed without thought. His shoulders dropped, his jaw loosened. He became still, but not asleep. Grant began trusting those shifts more than his own first sense of the air. On the morning he set the first sided post for the front frame, Rook refused to step through the entrance. Grant had cut the post twice already and thought he had it close. The timber rose square enough when he braced it in place, and from outside the joint looked tight. He was about to secure it when he noticed the dog standing just beyond the threshold, ears canted toward the left edge, body held back not by fear, but by objection. That made him stop. Grant put one hand near the seam between the post and the stone and waited. For several breaths he felt nothing. Then the wind changed direction outside, and a narrow current slid inward along that edge so delicately that he might have missed it if Rook had not already marked the place with his whole body. He lowered the post without a word. The correction took the rest of the morning. He cut away a sliver from the lower side, adjusted the angle, shaved more from the back, then raised it once more. This time, when the late gust came, the pressure broke outside the frame instead of sneaking around it. Rook crossed the entrance only then, moving past the post as if granting approval. Grant said nothing, but from that moment on, he gave the dog's hesitation more authority than his own impatience. The front wall rose slowly after that, one honest fit at a time. He lost entire afternoons to work. No visitor would have understood. Hours disappeared into a single joint. The outer frame had to sit true, but the inner meeting points mattered even more. Any place where the stone and wood failed each other would become a leak, and a leak here was not inconvenience. It was surrender. By the 4th evening, what he had accomplished would have looked ridiculous to most men in the valley. In the time a normal crew might have thrown together half a cabin, Grant had only a section of wall, a partial frame, and a scatter of shaped timbers stacked in order of use. The progress could be measured more honestly in what no longer happened. Light no longer cut through certain seams, pressure no longer curled along certain joints, the disturbed air at the entrance no longer reached where it had before. These were not changes a man could point to proudly from across a yard, but they were the only ones that mattered. That was usually when doubt arrived. It came near dusk, when the day's labor sat in front of him, looking too small, and the weather behind him seemed to be gaining size. Grant would stand in the half-built entrance, adze slack in his hand, and feel the arithmetic turn against him. Winter did not reward correctness if correctness came too late. There were evenings when he looked at the salvaged stacks, the still incomplete frame, the old cabin reduced now to a skeleton of what had once been his best attempt, and wondered if he had traded one kind of failure for another, more elaborate one. On one of those evenings, a figure crossed the yard and stopped at the mouth of the crevice. Sarah Whitlock. She had come on foot from the road, carrying a burlap sack against her hip, and wearing the same long brown coat he remembered from Cedar Hollow, though now it was drawn tight at the throat against the worsening air. Wind had loosened a few strands of her dark hair from their pins, and they crossed her cheek in restless lines. Up close, the economy of her strength was even more apparent than before. She wasted no movement, no expression, no sympathy. "I figured you were either forgetting to eat," she said, "or trying to prove a point to the weather." Grant wiped his hand on his coat before taking the sack. Maybe both. Inside were biscuits wrapped in cloth, a piece of smoked meat, and a small jar of rendered fat. The smell alone nearly undid him. Sarah stepped nearer the frame and ran her eyes along the fitted beam, then toward the stone where wood met granite so tightly that even the fading light found little to enter. "You're not building a house," she said. Grant looked at her. "No?" She touched the rock lightly. "You're building a seal." He let that sit. She glanced back toward the stripped remains of the old cabin in the yard. The Carters kept thinking thicker walls were the answer. By the second winter, they were burning more wood than they could cut. Her voice never softened, but it held no meanness in it either. "Most people out here think surviving means enduring more. Sometimes it means asking a different question." When she left, she did so without waiting to see whether her words had landed. That, more than the food, made the kindness easier to accept. By the 6th day of the work, Daniel Hargrove rode past again. He didn't stop at first. He slowed, looked at the partial front wall fitted into the granite, then circled back with the guarded expression of a man encountering proof he had not expected to exist. He remained in the saddle, eyes moving along the seams, the braces, the salvaged timbers, now altered enough to look born into a second life. "Hell of a slow way to build," he said. Grant drove a wedge under a beam and leaned on it. "Fast didn't help much last time," Daniel grunted. The sound carried something that was not disagreement. "Roof's where you'll get yourself killed if you guess wrong. I know." For a while, Daniel said nothing else. Then he reached behind the saddle, pulled loose a coil of rawhide lifting straps, and tossed them down. Grant caught them awkwardly against his chest. "Use those," Daniel said. "Better than breaking your hands on every long piece." That was all. No speech, no approval, no ceremony. But Grant understood the gift for what it was. The Valley's version of respect, stripped of every decorative word. The straps changed the pace just enough to matter, not enough to make the work easy, only possible for longer each day. Grant could hoist the heavier beams into position without wasting his strength before the fitting began. By the 8th day, the front wall stood high enough to cast its own shadow into the still pocket beyond. He set the doorframe next, aligning it so the opening sat just inside the point where the air lost force. That night, long after the usable light had gone, he sat just inside the unfinished structure, while the wind crossed the yard outside in visible strokes through the grass. Rook lay near him, one ear lifting whenever a gust struck the open ground, then easing again in the calm behind the frame. The threat was still there. It just no longer sounded absolute. Grant rested one cracked hand against the nearest timber and closed his eyes for a moment. Slow, tired, not finished, but right. For now, that was enough. The first cold front arrived after dark, before Grant Calloway had fully allowed himself to believe the house was ready. All afternoon, the sky had been thinning into a hard metallic gray, the kind that seemed to drain shape and color out of the valley before weather ever touched the ground. By dusk, the air outside the crevice had sharpened enough to sting his throat when he breathed too deeply. He finished the last small tasks by failing light, tightening the inner latch, setting the final shelf bracket, carrying in another armload of split wood, and did them with the weary concentration of a man who no longer had the strength to separate fear from routine. When he shut the door against the evening, he did not think of the house as complete. He thought only that there was nothing more he could do before the wind put his work on trial. The room inside was narrow but settled, 3 sides pressed into stone. The roofline held low where timber met granite, and the single front wall faced the valley with 1 door and 1 modest window, nothing extra for the weather to exploit. It did not resemble the cabins men built in open country. It looked more like something the rock had reluctantly accepted into itself. Grant moved through the space slowly, not admiring it, only checking it with the old habits that had survived every other version of his life. Door, window, stove, bed, wood, water. Rook entered last and turned once before lying down near the stove. The German shepherd's body eased to the floor with a kind of tired certainty Grant had not seen from him in the old cabin. During those weeks of building, the dog had lived in a state just short of vigilance, reacting to every shift of air, every poorly fitted seam, every human hesitation. Here, inside the new walls, he still listened, but not with the same guarded tension. It was the first sign of truth Grant trusted. He knelt at the stove and built the fire carefully, coaxing the flames up from kindling to small wood, then to thicker pieces cut from the cabin he had torn down with his own hands. The irony did not escape him. The old house, which had failed to protect him, would now help warm the structure that replaced it. The fire took hold and spread with a steadier appetite than he expected. He stayed crouched there longer than necessary, one hand resting against his knee, studying the metal as heat gathered and settled into the room. Then the wind arrived for real. It did not begin as a howl. It came first as pressure, a force leaning against the outer world in long, organized bands. He heard it take the valley before he heard what it meant for the house. Somewhere beyond the rock, something loose struck and dragged. The old stacked remnants of the first cabin creaked where they were tied down. Grass and grit hissed low against the ground outside. Grant waited for the next familiar part. The dry rattle at the door frame, the cold seam along the floorboards, the way warmth in the room used to retreat as if ashamed of itself. Nothing followed. The stove burned in the corner with the same low, steady confidence it had held a few minutes before. The warmth widened instead of fleeing. It gathered near the ceiling and remained there long enough to drift back down. The floor at the foot of the bed did not harden into ice beneath his boots. The shadowed corner beside the stacked wood did not fill with creeping cold. Even the small tin cup of water he set near the wall remained liquid, faint steam lifting from its surface when he leaned close enough to see. Grant did not relax yet. He had trusted too early before. So he fed the stove only lightly and let the night deepen around them. The storm outside organized itself further, settling into a single continuous force rather than a sequence of gusts. He could hear the difference clearly. In the open valley, the wind ruled by repetition, press, drag, press again. But what reached the front of the Crevice house no longer felt like the same thing. The granite took the force first. The narrow entrance broke it. By the time the air reached the front wall, it had lost the clean line of its violence. It was still weather. It was still cold. It simply no longer arrived with authority. Near midnight, Grant rose and unlatched the door just enough to test what the room had already told him. The cold hit the gap immediately, hard and intentional. Snow had begun by then, not in soft flakes, but in thin, dry streaks driven nearly sideways through the yard. The wind outside was strong enough to make the tied lumber shift and knock against itself in the dark. He shut the door again, set the latch, and felt the room seal behind him like a held breath. That was when something in him finally gave way. Not fear. The need to keep bracing against fear. Rook lifted his head once at the sound of the latch, looked toward the door, and then lowered it again without moving from his place. In the old cabin, the dog had always slept in fragments during weather, if he slept at all. He had learned to put his body where the leaks were worst, as if the only protection available was his own willingness to lie in the path of whatever came through. Here, he no longer did that. He occupied the room the way living things do when they believe, at least for a few hours, that the danger will remain outside them. Grant sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the space in the stove's dim orange light. The room was plain enough to embarrass a proud man. A narrow cot, a shortened table reworked from the old cabin, a few pegs in the wall, shelves that followed the stone where the stone refused straightness, a small stove, stacked wood, nothing decorative, nothing generous. Yet for the first time in years, plainness did not feel like lack. It felt like relief. Toward dawn, he heard another sound beyond the wind, not close enough to be a knock, but irregular enough to belong to something man-made. He stood, opened the door only wide enough to listen, then shut it again. The storm still held the valley in its teeth. If someone needed help, light would have to come first. When morning finally broke, it did so without color. The world beyond the crevice looked scraped down to bone, gray snow skimming sideways over hard ground, fence lines blurred by motion, rooftops taking the weather from all directions at once. Grant stepped out with Rook at his side and saw immediately what the night had cost everyone else. Smoke from houses lower in the valley rose only to be ripped flat and carried away. At Daniel Hargrove's place, part of the lean-to beside the barn had collapsed inward where older boards had given up under sustained pressure. Farther off, one stretch of Whitlock fencing lay flat, the rails driven down as if the land itself had pressed them under. Men were already outside in heavy coats and bent shoulders, carrying rope, buckets, wood, whatever the morning demanded before the next round of wind took more than the last. Grant stood in the mouth of his own house and looked back once over his shoulder. Inside, the stove still carried useful heat. The blanket still held sleep. The cup on the table had not frozen. A rider appeared through the blowing veil before noon. Daniel Hargrove came in on a dark horse, crusted pale along the mane and shoulders with blown frost. He did not dismount. He did not need to. Men like him could give respect and keep their distance at the same time. He looked first at Grant, then at the front wall fitted inside the stone, then at the stacked wood that was still largely untouched. "Well," he said at last, his voice roughened by cold and the effort of saying something he had not expected to say. "Damn me!" Grant's mouth almost turned, but what rose in him was quieter than amusement. "Lean-to? Part of it," Daniel said. He shifted in the saddle and studied the doorway again. "You burn heavy all night?" Less than before. Daniel's gaze lingered on the seam where wood met granite. Something in his expression changed. Not softened exactly, but revised. "Holt'll hate this." Probably. A short breath left Daniel that might have been the nearest thing he allowed himself to satisfaction. Good. Then he rode on, because the valley still had demands to make of him. Yet the exchange stayed with Grant after the rider vanished into the white-gray movement. Respect had entered the space not as praise, but as witness. Sarah came later, on foot, wrapped more tightly than before, her scarf pulled high and her dark hair tucked beneath it, except for a few strands whipped loose by the wind. She stepped inside only far enough to feel the room around her. Her eyes moved to the stove, to the walls, then to the floor, as if testing whether the quiet she sensed was real. "It's quiet," she said. Grant nodded. That seemed to reach her more deeply than the warmth. She stood still another second, then looked down at the boards under her boots. "The Carters never got quiet," she said. Not once the wind found them. After she left, Grant sat again beside the stove while Rook lay near the door, not guarding it now, only using the space. The storm still raged outside. It still moved over the valley, still worried roofs and fences, and whatever was not built for patience. He did not mistake his house for victory. Winter had many shapes left to show, but what moved him most was not the proof that the room could be warmed. It was the proof that the storm had failed to become intimate. For the first time since the war, Grant could hear violence outside himself without feeling it continue inside. He had not beaten the storm. He had simply found the one place it could not fully enter. Darren Holt did not return to the granite line because admiration had softened him. Men like Darren did not change in that manner. They did not wake one morning, discover humility waiting by the stove, and decide to wear it. Whatever altered in them did so the way wood altered under seasons of strain, quietly, reluctantly, and only after resistance became more exhausting than acceptance. For 3 days after the first hard front moved through the valley, Darren told himself a version of the story that allowed him to keep his habits intact. Grant Calloway had found a lucky angle. The rock had broken the worst of the first blow. Any shelter looked clever when compared against lesser damage. The explanation was thin, but it held well enough to sit beside his coffee and let him get through the morning. Then the valley kept talking. Everywhere he went, weather had left its handwriting behind. A torn lean-to at Daniel Hargrove's place, flattened fence sections on Whitlock land, a shed door ripped half off its lower hinge behind the Cooper's yard, men mending what the wind had tested, and women carrying hot water through cold yards while pretending not to notice how close each winter always stood to hunger. Darren knew that language. He trusted it because it was honest. Structures either answered weather well or they didn't. And yet the place by the granite outcrop did not fit the grammar. From his own yard, he had listened through the first storm and heard the expected sounds moving across the valley. Loose boards rattling, tin complaining, animals restless in their pens, a roof beam somewhere taking the burden badly. What he had not heard was the answering distress from Grant's place. The wind had reached it. He had seen the snow driving low across the open ground and slamming against the rock. But what came back from there had been almost nothing. That was what stayed with him, not the warmth, not the story, the absence of struggle. On the fourth morning after the front, Darren rode out before sunrise with a carpenter's satchels strapped behind the saddle and a length of cord coiled at his hip. He tied the horse below the rise instead of near the house, more from instinct than secrecy, then climbed the rest of the way on foot. Frost had silvered the broken grass, and the cold made each breath feel cut rather than drawn. Grant saw him from the doorway and did not bother with courtesy. Darren crossed the yard in his long, hard stride, the one that always gave the impression he was entering an argument rather than a place. Up close, he looked more worn than he had in town. Cold had sharpened the angles of his face, deepened the hollows around his mouth, and stiffened the short gray beard along his jaw. The old saw injury on his left hand had left one finger shortened at the second knuckle, and he rubbed that hand now and then with his glove off, a habit that appeared whenever he was forcing himself to think against pride. "I didn't come here to praise it," he said. Grant leaned one shoulder against the frame. "That's lucky. I don't sell tickets." Darren gave him a dry, unimpressed look. "I came to see what I missed." Grant stepped aside just enough to show he would not stop him. The older man began outside the mouth of the crevice. He tied short strips of cloth along the cord and fixed one end to a stake driven into the ground where the open wind crossed the yard cleanly. The strip snapped and streamed hard. Then he carried the other end inward, toward the entrance, holding the line level and watching how the cloth changed. Just inside the mouth, it still moved, but not with the same order. Deeper in, the motion broke further, not absent, diminished, disorganized, made uncertain. He repeated the test 3 times from slightly different positions, each time narrowing his eyes as though stubbornness alone might restore the result he expected. It did not. Rook sat several feet away, watching with the grave attention he gave men who handled serious things with unsure hands. He neither approached nor retreated. He only followed Darren with his eyes, as if waiting to see whether this one would learn slowly or badly. Grant let the older man work through the morning in near silence. He had no appetite left for proving anything. The weather had already done what argument could not. It had placed fact where opinion liked to stand. Darren came back the next day with 2 galvanized buckets. One he left outside the crevice where the wind ran uninterrupted across open ground. The other he carried well inside, near the deeper section where the house sat just beyond the bend that broke the force of the air. He said almost nothing while placing them, only glanced once toward the front wall of Grant's house, and then back at the buckets, as though refusing to let the structure itself influence the test. Before dawn the next morning, he returned. Grant was already up, splitting a small pile of kindling by lantern glow. He watched Darren crouch by the outer bucket first. A thick skin of ice had formed over the top, harder at the edges, cloudy where the cold had settled longest. Darren tapped it once with his knuckle, then lifted the bucket slightly and set it back down. He carried no expression with him into the crevice, but he carried expectation. The inner bucket did not meet him the same way. A thin crust had gathered near one shaded edge, but most of the water remained dark, loose, and unfrozen. Darren stared at it for so long that Grant finally set the kindling aside and stepped closer. "Well?" Grant asked. Darren straightened slowly. "I don't like it." Grant nodded. "That isn't the same as being wrong." The older man looked toward the entrance where the first gray hint of dawn had begun to make the frost shine. "No," he said after a moment. "It isn't." That morning, for the first time, Darren asked to see the seams. Grant led him inside without flourish. Darren ran his good fingers along the places where wood met stone. He crouched at the lower edges of the front wall. He stood by the window and then near the stove. He pressed his palm flat against the front interior, while the outside wind moved faintly at the mouth of the crevice. He paced the room once, then again more slowly, not as a guest, but as a craftsman trying to locate the missing step in his own thinking. "There ought to be more draw in here," he muttered. "That was the idea," Grant said. Darren glanced at him. "Don't talk to me like I'm slow. I'm talking to you like you're late." That earned a short exhale through the nose, almost laughter, though Darren still seemed unwilling to fully trust the sound. From then on, he began appearing at odd intervals. Mid-morning once, near sunset another time, before sunrise on the coldest morning of the week. He never came empty-handed. A folding rule, a carpenter's square, chalk, a thin strip of pine he could notch and bend against irregular surfaces. The tools were simple, but the attention behind them was not. He was no longer trying to expose a trick. He was trying to understand why every rule he had trusted in open country building failed to explain what the rock was doing here. What changed first was not his opinion, it was his body. In town, when Grant had first spoken of the crevice, Darren had worn certainty like armor. Chest forward, jaw set, every line in him arranged to repel foolishness before it came too close. Here, at the granite line, that posture began to leave him. He leaned now instead of bracing. He stood longer before speaking. He lifted a hand into the moving air at the mouth of the crevice and then held it deeper inside, turning his wrist as if feeling where force stopped being one thing and became another. "It breaks here," he said one evening, not looking away from the stone. Grant stepped beside him, not all at once. "No." Darren shifted his hand inward a little more. "But enough." The next afternoon they spoke not as rivals, but as men cornered by the same stubborn material. Darren asked where Grant had first trusted the line of the front wall, which inward curl of wind seemed strongest when weather came off the ridge, how much gap the stone allowed in places where absolute contact was impossible. Grant answered where he could, and showed where words failed. Between them, the exchange became something neither would have named aloud, because naming it might have embarrassed them both. One day Eli Mercer came up the path with a feed sack over one shoulder and slowed at the sight of Darren Holt standing by the crevice with one hand against Grant's outer wall like a student before a lesson. Eli's expression changed so visibly that even Darren noticed without turning. "Keep moving, Mercer," Darren said. "I'm not a spectacle." Eli grinned and did as instructed, which only made Darren mutter more irritably once he had gone. By the end of the week, Darren came without tools. Grant was outside near the chopping block, breaking down kindling, when he saw the older man step into the yard and remove his gloves finger by finger before folding them into one coat pocket. There was something almost formal in the motion, and Grant realized after a second what it was closest to: nervousness. "I want to map it," Darren said. Grant rested the axe head against the block. "Map what?" "The bend, the mouth, the points where the force breaks and where it doesn't." Darren's eyes shifted once toward the house, then back. "The wall placement, too. How close you let it ride the stone. Where you left room and why." Grant let the silence sit. This then was the true turning, not agreement, not surrender, a request made without the shelter of superiority. Darren exhaled once. "I'm asking," he said, "not correcting." For a long second, the only sounds were the faint click of the settling stove inside the house and the far scrape of wind along the upper ridge. Then Grant nodded. "All right." Darren's shoulders eased almost invisibly. "Good," he said. He did not thank him. Men like him rarely did, not in words. Instead, he turned toward the rock with the deep, unsparing concentration he reserved for things he meant to learn properly. That was enough. Rook came to stand beside Grant and leaned his shoulder briefly against his leg. Grant rested one hand on the dog's neck and looked toward the granite where the wind had once seemed like law. The strangest part was not that Darren Holt had begun to believe. It was that belief, once it arrived, had taken the form of study. Darren Holt returned 2 mornings later, with frost in his beard, sawdust still clinging to the sleeves of his coat, and the expression of a man who had spent the better part of the night arguing with himself until honesty finally won by attrition. Grant was outside the granite house splitting stove wood when he heard the crunch of boots over the frozen ground. He looked up once, saw Darren, and lowered the axe head to the block without speaking. The older carpenter did not approach like a man bringing friendship. He approached like a man bringing a fact he had fought and lost to. "I said enough in town to make a fool of myself twice over," Darren said. "No point trying to save any of it now." Grant waited. Darren rubbed the shortened finger on his left hand with his thumb, an old habit that returned whenever something mattered more than he wanted it to. His face looked harsher in cold weather, hollows deeper in the cheeks, the gray beard pulled tighter to the jaw, the old scar near his mouth sharper when he spoke. "I was wrong," he said, "about the house, about the crack in the rock, about what you were really doing." Grant could have made him work harder for that sentence. He could have reminded him of the laugh in the yard, the crowd in earshot, the easy cruelty of certainty. But the valley was already moving toward another hard spell, and weather left little room for ceremonial pride. "The wind doesn't care who mocked who," Grant said. Darren let out a short breath through his nose. "No, it doesn't." He looked beyond Grant toward the valley, where roofs and sheds sat low in the pale morning light, like things waiting to be tested again. "That's why we need to take this farther than your doorway." That made Grant straighten. Darren saw it and kept going before the moment could cool. Not the house itself. Most people don't have a granite wall waiting behind them, but the thinking, the way you shortened what the wind could catch, the way you broke its run before it got inside. He paused, then added in his rough, practical way, "If we can teach the valley to stop offering the weather such clean tarts, we might save some roofs, some livestock, maybe a few lungs." Grant turned that over once in his mind and found no vanity in it, only work. "Then we start now," he said. They began at Daniel Hargrove's place because Daniel's barn had already shown them where winter liked to get its fingers in. The lean-to on the north side still leaned wrong from the first cold front, and one corner of the roof had been re-nailed so recently the hammer marks were still bright in the wood. Daniel met them in the yard with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a temper he wore the way some men wore scarves, plainly and for practical reasons. "If this is about my barn collapsing," he said, "you're both late. It already had the decency to do it." Darren ignored the tone. "It didn't collapse because the boards were weak. It collapsed because the whole side gave the wind too much face." Daniel frowned at that, not from offense, but from the concentration of a man forced to stop thinking in the only way he trusted. Grant crouched near the side run and traced a line in the frost with one gloved finger. "It comes in here," he said, "then curls under the eave and keeps pulling." He looked up. "You don't need a stronger wall first. You need less wall in the wrong place." That was how the lesson began to travel, not as theory, not as miracle, but as correction. Cut the exposure, break the draft line, let the air lose its shape before it reaches the animals, the feed, the sleeping room, the water barrel. They shortened the open side of Daniel's lean-to with salvaged planks and created an inner partition that left a still pocket between outer wall and stall. They rehung a feed room door so it opened away from the prevailing gust instead of into it. They narrowed the undergap by less than an inch and stopped enough low draft to matter. None of it was dramatic. All of it was useful. Sarah Whitlock received them the next day at the grain shed behind her house, ledger tucked under one arm, dark hair bound more tightly than usual against the cold. She took one look at Darren standing beside Grant and said, "Well, the world really has shifted." "Not enough," Darren muttered, "but we're trying." Sarah's storage shed had a different problem. It did not take the wind in broadside the way Daniel's lean-to had. Instead, It leaked it low and steadily through a warped side door, then let it rise through the room in a narrow, invisible path that froze jars, spoiled roots, and stiffened sacks of grain from one corner outward. Grant stepped inside and stood still for a few seconds, head slightly turned. Rook followed, stopped near the threshold, then angled his ears toward the lower hinge. "Here," Grant said, pressing 2 fingers to the seam. "It's entering low, then climbing." Sarah watched him, then nodded once. "North shelf always goes first." Darren crouched, checked the frame, and grunted. "We don't need a bigger latch. We need to stop giving the draft a corridor." Together they added a rough inner baffle wall from scrap timber and canvas, leaving a narrow air pocket between outer door and storage shelves. They shifted the sacks, moved the root bins, and raised the lowest shelf just enough to keep it out of the draft's direct path. Again, it did not look like genius. It looked like attention. That became Grant's role in the days that followed. Darren could persuade because the valley trusted his hands, but Grant could sense, almost physically, the places where air still moved wrong. He would step into a shed, a lambing room, a coop, or a kitchen mudroom, and stand in silence long enough for the room to confess its weakness. Then he would kneel by a gap, rest his palm near a seam, and say, "Here." This is where it starts. He never made a performance of it. If someone thanked him warmly, he nodded and kept working. If someone doubted him, he let Darren argue. If neither man's words were enough, they showed instead. "Hold your hat here," Darren would say, letting the wind catch it. "Now, step back 2 feet behind this angle and feel what changed. Watch the cloth strip at this side. See how it dies there. Listen to the door now that the cross run is gone." By the 3rd day, people stopped calling it Grant's trick and began calling it common sense they should have noticed sooner. Eli Mercer attached himself to the work without being invited. At first, he carried tools, then timber, then messages. By the end of the week, he was going ahead to tell people to leave their bad hinges and warped doors untouched until Darren and Grant got there. He was still young enough to look surprised by his own usefulness, but the surprise was fading. Some men grow into themselves only when they are needed often enough. Not everyone accepted the change gracefully. At one property near the south edge of the valley, a broad-shouldered rancher named Tom Blevins stood with both thumbs hooked into his belt and announced that no wind in Colorado was clever enough to outthink a good wall. Tom was in his 40s, thick through the neck and shoulders, with a red-brown mustache that made his face look more stubborn than it already was. He had inherited his father's place and most of his father's convictions, including the belief that tradition counted as proof. Darren let him talk longer than Grant expected. Then he walked to the side of Tom's feed shed, lifted his hat into the full draft, and let the wind nearly take it from his hand. After that, he stepped 2 feet sideways behind a short board angle they had just propped temporarily into place. "Stand here," Darren said. Tom did, mostly to prove he would not be persuaded. The difference registered anyway. The older carpenter put the hat back on his head. "A stronger wall is fine," he said, "but why give the weather all of you when you can give it less?" Tom never admitted they were right. He did, however, help nail the angled break in place before sunset. That was how the town began to change, not in revelation, but in correction. Brush windbreaks stacked against the worst exposed coops. Shed doors rehung to avoid taking the full push of the gust. Inner partitions built to create pockets of dead air where warmth could collect instead of being dragged through broad open rooms. Small windows boarded partly in, not to darken a room, but to shorten the line the weather could use. Barn walls doubled where they needed air pockets, not brute thickness. Roof braces moved, gaps narrowed, runs broken. Nothing in it was theatrical. The valley did not become beautiful because of it. It became less foolish. One afternoon, while resetting a latch for an older widow named Mrs. Bell, Grant heard the question people had been circling without saying plainly. She stood wrapped in 2 shawls and a coat too broad at the shoulders, her frame thin as winter brush, but her gaze sharp enough to make younger people tell the truth around her. "Why are you giving this away?" she asked. "If it saved your place, why not keep it your advantage?" Grant looked up from the latch, then out past her toward the low roofs below. "Because the wind doesn't stop at my yard," he said. The answer went farther than he intended. By the time the next front threatened the ridges, the valley had not been transformed so much as corrected. Barn sides shortened and tucked tighter. Coops better screened. Sheds divided more intelligently. Feed rooms less exposed. Doors and roofs quieter under pressure. People still burned wood. Animals still needed watching. Winter was still winter, but the wind had fewer clean paths into the places where life was kept. The most remarkable part was not that people listened. It was that Grant never treated the knowledge as property. Darren understood the weight of that better than anyone. One evening, after they had spent half the day reinforcing a lambing shed near the North Road, he stood beside Grant above the valley and watched smoke rise straighter from several roofs before the wind managed to flatten it. "You could have kept it," Darren said. Grant knew he meant more than the method. He meant the advantage, the proof, the right to say I found this and suffered for it, so it belongs to me. "It wouldn't stay mine long," Grant said. Darren folded his gloves slowly. Still, Grant watched Rook move ahead through the frost-hardened grass, then glanced back to make sure the men were following. "A warm house is useful," he said. "A valley that's ready is better." Darren stood very still, then gave a single nod. Not to Grant exactly, but to the truth itself. That night, back inside the granite house with the stove ticking softly and the room holding its hard-earned quiet, Grant sat by the window and looked out over the dark spread of roofs below. What had begun as a private rescue had become preparation. And somewhere in the middle of that change, without trying to be more than useful, he had stopped being a man merely living near the town and become part of it. Darren Holt chose a morning hard with frost to say what he had spent days trying not to say. He came up the slope with his coat half dusted in sawdust, beard silvered white along the edges by cold, and the stiff expression of a man who had argued with himself long enough to lose. Grant was outside the granite house splitting stove wood, and the rhythm of the axe did not stop when he saw Darren coming. Rook, standing nearby with one paw slightly lifted against the cold ground, noticed first, then looked back at Grant as if marking that something serious was crossing the yard. Darren stopped at the chopping block, removed one glove, and rubbed the shortened finger on his left hand with his thumb. It was the same old habit Grant had noticed before, something the older carpenter did when honesty cost him more than he liked. His face looked even harsher in the cold, cheekbones sharper, mouth flatter, eyes pale and difficult to read. "I was wrong," he said. Grant let the axe head rest in the block and waited. Darren exhaled once. "About the crack in the rock, about the house, about laughing before I understood a damn thing." Grant could have answered in a way that made the man feel it longer. There would have been justice in that, and maybe a little satisfaction too. But the valley had another front coming, and winter had already made clear that it did not care who had mocked whom first. "The cold doesn't sort men by pride," Grant said. Darren gave a short nod, almost impatient with the truth because it arrived so cleanly. "That's why I'm here, not to turn you into a story, not to drag people up this hill and tell them they should build themselves into rock. Most of them can't. But what you figured out, less exposure, broken wind, still air, that can travel." He looked out over the valley, toward the low roofs and sheds, crouched under the pale morning light. And it should. Grant followed the line of his gaze. The idea had been forming quietly in him ever since the first storm had passed. The rock house itself could not be repeated everywhere, but the principle could. Wind did not need drama to do harm. It only needed a long path and a clean target. "Then we take it," Grant said. They began that afternoon at Daniel Hargrove's place because Daniel's barn had already given Winter something to brag about. The lean-to on the north side still sagged at one corner, and the outer boards carried fresh hammer marks from hasty repairs that had kept it standing but not corrected what had gone wrong. Daniel met them in the yard with a coil of rope thrown over one shoulder, and suspicion already settled into his face. He was broad and thick through the chest, his beard rough with frost, his eyes narrowed from a lifetime of looking toward trouble before it arrived. "If this is the part where you tell me my barn is stupid," he said, "I'd rather hear it after coffee." "It isn't stupid," Darren answered. "It's just standing wrong." That bought them enough time to start. They walked the perimeter slowly, Grant watching how the open side took the wind, Darren studying the angle of the roof and the exposed run beneath the eaves. Daniel listened more than he spoke, which for him was the same as admitting the conversation mattered. Grant crouched near the lower edge and traced a line through the frost with one gloved finger. "It enters here," he said. "Not all at once, but enough. Then it curls under and drags the warmth right out of the stalls." Darren slapped one palm against the outer wall. "You don't need twice the lumber. You need less face and less runway." By dusk, they had shortened the exposed side with salvaged boards, built an inner barrier that created a narrow, quiet pocket between the animals and the windward wall, and rehung the feed room door to stop the gusts from striking it cleanly. None of it looked grand. It looked like correction. But that evening, the horses stopped shifting so hard in their stalls, and the water near the back held open longer into the night. The next day took them to Whitlock Land. Sarah met them outside the storage shed with a scarf at her throat and a ledger tucked under one arm. Her hair was pinned back, though the wind had already pulled free a few dark strands along her cheek. She looked from Darren to Grant and lifted one eyebrow. "The valley must truly be desperate," she said. "You two look organized." "Don't spread that around," Darren muttered. The shed behind her had a different flaw. It did not face the wind too broadly. Instead, it leaked it low and steadily through a warped side door, letting the draft run thin and cold beneath shelves, past grain sacks, and up the back wall where the preserves sat. Grant stepped inside and stood still long enough for the room to confess itself. Rook followed, paused near the threshold, and angled his ears toward the lower hinge. "Here," Grant said, touching the seam. "That shelf freezes first, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded at once. "Every time." They showed her the path of the draft not as theory, but as something her own winters had already taught her to recognize. Darren measured the gap. Grant traced the route through the room. Together they added a rough inner baffle from scrap timber and canvas, moved the grain sacks, raised the lowest shelf, and broke the clean line the cold had been using. Sarah watched it all with the steady attention of someone who did not need to be persuaded twice once truth had introduced itself properly. That became their method in the days that followed. They did not preach, they corrected. Sometimes the change was small enough to sound almost insulting at first. Narrow the gap under a shed door. Leave the vent high, not low. Rehang a coupe door so it opened away from the prevailing gust instead of into it. Build a brush break where an open run invited wind to gather speed. Add an inner partition, not for strength, but for stillness. Reduce the face. Break the run, preserve the quiet pocket. Darren proved better at carrying the lesson than Grant had expected. At first, people listened because he was Darren Holt, and his hands had framed, rebared, or straightened half their outbuildings. By the third day, they listened because he no longer sounded like a man repeating another man's strange idea. He sounded like someone who had tested it against his own pride and found it stronger. At one chicken run near the Cooper's yard, he held his hat out into the full draft until the wind nearly tore it from his hand. Then he stepped 3 feet aside behind a temporary board angle they had just set and said, "There, that's all we're after. Make the weather spend itself before it reaches what matters." Not everyone changed politely. Tom Blevins, a broad-shouldered rancher with a heavy neck and a red-brown mustache, told them flatly that no gust in Colorado could outthink a proper wall. He had inherited his father's place and most of his father's convictions, and he wore both with the same stubbornness. Darren let him talk until the words began circling themselves, then repeated the hat demonstration and made Tom stand where the board broke the force. Tom never said they were right. He did help nail the windbreak in place before sundown. Eli Mercer joined the work without being asked. At first he carried tools and planks. Then he carried messages from one side of the valley to the other. The young man still had the narrow frame and uncertain earnestness of someone only partway through becoming himself. But usefulness sharpened him. By the time the week was half over, he was arriving before dawn to ask where they were headed next. And all through it, Grant moved in the same way. Quiet, practical, never acting like he was handing out wisdom, only trying to keep the next cold from finding an easy path into another family's winter. He would step into a barn, a grain room, a lambing shed, stand still for a few seconds, then kneel and press his cracked hand to a seam. Here, he would say, this is where it starts. That was all most people needed. One afternoon, while resetting a latch for an older widow named Mrs. Bell, he finally heard the question others had only circled around. Mrs. Bell was small and bird-boned beneath 2 shawls and a coat too broad at the shoulder, but her eyes were exact and bright. Grief had pared her down without making her weak. "Why are you giving this away?" she asked. "If it saved your place, why not keep it as your advantage?" Grant looked up from the latch, then past her to the low spread of roofs and fences below. "Because the wind doesn't stop at my yard," he said. The answer traveled farther than he meant it to. By the time the next front threatened the ridge, the valley had not turned beautiful. It had turned less foolish. Barn sides sat tighter. Coops took less direct exposure. Storage sheds held their warmth longer. Doors rattled less. Roof edges no longer shuddered so violently under the first push of a gust. Nothing about the change was theatrical. It was all small. That was why it mattered. One evening, after a day spent reinforcing a lambing shed near the North Road, Darren stood beside Grant and looked down over the valley, where smoke lifted a little straighter before the wind bent it away. "You could have kept it," Darren said. Grant knew he meant more than the method. He meant the advantage, the right to say, "I found this. I paid for it. It belongs to me." "It wouldn't stay mine long," Grant said. Darren folded his gloves slowly. "Still." Rook moved ahead through the frost-hardened grass, then paused and looked back, making sure the men followed. Grant watched him, then the valley beyond. "A warm house is useful," he said. "A valley that's ready is better." This time Darren did smile, though only with one side of his mouth. "You're harder to argue with now," he said. "Might be because you stopped trying to win." That night, back inside the granite house, with the stove ticking softly and the room holding its hard-earned quiet, Grant sat by the window and looked out over the dark spread of roofs below. What had begun as a private rescue had become preparation. And somewhere in that change, without ever meaning to be more than useful, he had stopped being merely the veteran by the rock and become part of the valley's way of getting through winter. Sometimes a miracle does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes quietly, hidden in a crack of stone, in the loyalty of a dog, in the humility of a man willing to learn again, and in a town choosing to help one another before the cold grows too deep. Grant did not defeat winter by strength alone. He survived because he listened, because he changed, and because when the answer finally came, he did not keep it for himself. That is how life often works for all of us. The thing that saves us may not look impressive at first. It may seem too small, too strange, or too late. But God has a way of placing shelter in unexpected places, and sometimes His blessings arrive through wisdom, kindness, and the courage to share what we have learned with others.
Tell us where you're watching from and what part of this journey stayed with you. Subscribe for more stories about restoration and faith. And wherever you are, may God bless your home, guide your step, and bring life back into the place that once you forgotten.